Well, welcome to the Animal Behavior Course virtual field trip. We are here today at Shaw Nature Preserve, a preserve managed by the St. Louis Botanical Gardens, which is located just outside of the metro St. Louis area. During week 11 and 12 of the Animal Behavior Course, we explore some of the different reproductive strategies and mating systems of frogs and toads and many other species. Today, with special permission from Shaw Nature Preserve, we're going to highlight some of the different mating systems of some of the local frogs and toads and salamanders of the eastern United States. You may not be able to do what I'm going to be doing here today without special permission or permits, but I still encourage you to visit a local park or wetland and observe some of these amazing animal adaptations. So if you happen to live in a temperate zone like the one that we're in now, the breeding season typically begins in early spring with some of the beginning of the precipitation and some of the warming weather. If you happen to live in a more tropical region that has a dry or wet season, the breeding season typically correlates with the first few days of rain. Now let's go see what we can find here at Shaw Nature Preserve. So if you're looking for a place to go observe frogs and toad breeding systems and mating strategies, a place like this is great. Most frogs and toads are going to need an aquatic place to breed, and so a lake or a pond, but this one's particularly a good place because if you look at all the different vegetation behind me, this is a great place because it gives a lot of frogs everything they need. They have a place for cover from predators, they have a place for food, a lot of different items in here to eat. They also have a place for metamorphosis for their larvae, and they're surrounded by a wooded area, and it gives a lot of the frog species that live on terrestrial area most of the year a place to go after they're done breeding. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look for some of the different species here. Specifically, I'm looking for one of them that's around this time period that breeds is the cricket frog. And so the cricket frog is a kind of unique frog. It's a late breeding, spring breeding frog, so typically April, May, and June, you're going to hear them calling, and that's typically in the middle of April they've laid eggs, so we might be able to even find some larvae. And we're going to highlight some of his breeding strategies, and some of it is all acoustic, at least observation-wise. If you can't see it, you can still sometimes hear it. So one of the noises they make is it sounds typically like two pebbles hitting together. Now, they also make different noises, and a lot of times all we think about is their advertisement call, and that's the call where the males are trying to attract a female, and so they're typically making noises, and they make all kinds of them, but cricket frogs make that noise that's like tick, 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 and they can change that noise typically if they want to do different things. If a male gets too close, they get a little louder, and the sounds get a little closer together. If a female gets a little closer, they even change that, and it's called a courtship call, where they actually will make it a little softer, and that entices the female to come a little closer, and it signals to her that this is a male. And if she's receptive, what they'll typically do is they pair up, and they're trying to stay away from other males, and she will get close enough, and the male will mount her and grasp his front legs around her, which is called amplexus. And most frogs do this behavior, and/or toads do this behavior. And so, if she's receptive, she will shoot out some eggs out of her cloaca, and he will fertilize as they come out, and they'll drag the little egg mass to one of those different places. That's why the vegetation is really important. They'll stick it to some of the vegetation. But we can go see what we can find in here. We'll go see what kind of different things are active in here and what larval stages we can find. So one of the first rules of herpetology, and herpetology is the study of reptiles and amphibians, it's important to remember that there's always exceptions to the rule. And that holds true for most things in science, but there's definitely a lot of exceptions when it comes to frogs, toads, and salamanders. So when I talk about some of the different mating behaviors and reproductive strategies, one of the things to remember is that these are general strategies or adaptations, and that there's always exceptions to some of those rules. So keep that in mind the next time you go exploring and learn about different animals, that there probably are exceptions out there, and so a lot of times when we're learning about them, we're learning about the generalities about them that makes those groups similar to each other. So this is a male cricket frog, and cricket frogs belong to the Hylidae family or the tree frog family. So like its other members like the chorus frog and the spring peeper and the gray tree frog, these guys do have adhesive toe pads, but they're not as good as a tree frog. They don't go typically too far. What makes them a little bit different than some of their other species out there, which is neat, the ones they're related to, these guys go pretty far from this pond, and so they like rivers and creeks and stuff like that during the rest of the year. Typically breed in here and then move out. These guys move quite a bit in between ponds. They also have little bumps similar to like a toad or warts, and they're hard to see unless you get really close. As they get older, they get a little darker in color. But this is about full size for this particular animal. Now, right now, a lot of these guys have laid eggs in the middle of April. So a lot of the larvae, and we might see some in a minute, are going to be pretty small right now. The way you can tell a cricket frog tadpole, and we'll see if we find any, they look similar to a spring peeper tadpole or a chorus frog, except they have a black tip to the tail. So we'll see what different tadpoles we can find and what larval. But all of these guys live, for the most part, in the same pond and metamorphosize around the same time that spring peepers and chorus frogs do. They're just a little bit later. So this is like the second tier that's come out. And they'll actually call all the way into the summertime. But this is typically, if you hear the noises in the background, you hear a few males, and they get a little close to each other, they get a little more aggressive, and they try to fight acoustically to hold on to their territory. So if you take a look at this is one of our salamander spring breeders. So this is actually a central newt. And there's a couple of different species, but here in the Midwest, this is a pretty common newt species, and I think it's the only newt species. They're a little bit different than some of the other different types like frogs and toads in their reproductive strategy. So their courtship is pretty elaborate. So one of the things the males are going to do, and what they're going to do, typically when they find a female, is they're going to arch their back. They use their tail quite a bit arched up, and they do like a display to attract a female. If the female is receptive, what's going to happen is the male is actually going to release a spermatophore, which is like a little packet of sperm, and the female is going to go over top of it with a cloaca, which is like a common opening where they go to the bathroom and where their sex organs are, and she will actually pick up inside of her body the spermatophore and fertilize inside of her body. So a little bit different than frogs that fertilize outside the body. These guys fertilize inside, and then what they'll do is the female will go a little farther away and she'll release the fertilized eggs and stick them usually to a little piece of vegetation, and that's why these areas are really important with this heavy vegetation. Now this one's a pretty young one in here, but if we take a look, might be able to see a few things. Typically males have a little more swollen area with a cloaca. This is too young to tell, but if it was a male, where the cloaca is right between its legs would be pretty bright, round, and red. So this one's probably too young to tell. But typically males usually have a little more bigger spots underneath, but this is just a very young one. Now these are pretty toxic, which is kind of neat. So like a toad that sometimes has more toxins than other frogs, these guys typically are more poisonous or have toxins more so than the other relatives of the other salamander species. Now they also have a neat strategy where they start in the water. This is called an F stage. And after they finish metamorphosizing, so this one doesn't have any gills, so it's probably about ready. A little bit later in the year, closer to midsummer, it's going to make its way out of the pond, head towards the woods, and it's going to live in the woods for quite a while, several years, sometimes 2-3 years, before it comes back to the water to mate. So it takes a while for it to become mature to mate. A little bit different than frog species. The cricket frog I showed you typically only lives about 2 years. These guys, obviously, they're going to be outside of the water for 2 to 3 years before they even come back and mate. So their lifespan is just a little bit longer, a little bit different. These guys do have teeth, and this is how they eat all kinds of things. In the wild, in the water, they're going to be eating snails and small little invertebrates. When they're on land, they're going to do the same thing, ants and snails and things like that. So we'll let this one go, but it does have that bright color, which it uses it for sometimes for courtship, but also as a display to other animals, don't eat me, and sometimes they'll flash that tail with a bright color. Oh, that's an even better one. Yeah, here we go. There you go. So this is a tree frog tadpole, and it's related to our cricket frog tadpole. So these guys were laid just about the same time a cricket frog was laid in the water or fertilized and hatched. So if you take a look at the tree frog tadpole, one of the things that makes it a little bit different is these guys get preyed upon by a lot of crayfish. I'm sorry, not crayfish. These guys get preyed upon by quite a few dragonfly nymphs, and one of the colors they see really well is bright orange or red. And so these guys have evolved a reddish tail. Now, since they metamorphosized the tail, as long as they get far enough along and metamorphosize, it doesn't matter that they get the tail bit occasionally, as long as it stays away from their head. And so that's a neat adaptation specifically to the tree frog family. But it's easy to help tell apart this from a cricket frog, which has a black tip to its tail. And we'll keep pulling through, and let's see what other tadpoles we can find, other larvae. Now, a lot of them, we'll take a look what we have here. Just different stages. These are leopard frog babies. So here, whoop, where'd you go? Come here. These guys are slippery. Come here, buddy. There we go. So this is a leopard frog baby, and you can see it was laid early in late February and March, and it's already got the tail disappearing. I already have one that's completely already metamorphosized. Now this is actually related to your bullfrogs, your green frogs, your larger summer breeding frogs. This is one of the early large breeding frogs. And these guys make a pretty unique noise. It sounds kind of like laughter and like a chuckle. So it's kind of a neat particular frog species. And I'll go ahead and we'll show you a different, here he is. Whoop. Now this guy is fully metamorphosized, and if you take a look, he's got little back legs already ready. He's got the webbed toes. This guy is pretty well ready to go on his own here and fully metamorphosized. Now one of the things you can't quite see on this guy because he's kind of young and dark, but a lot of the larger frogs, they all have what's called a lateral line. And it's a thicker line that runs down the side behind their eye all the way down the side. And it also picks up on vibrations and other things in the water, and so it alerts them when things are moving around, and it helps these guys survive. And a lot of your larger frogs is pretty evident, or you can easily see it. And we'll let this guy go. He's actually sitting pretty still right now. So we'll take a look and see what kind of stuff. This is the typical makeup of a lot of those streams. And if you take a look right here, this is a very good example of one of the mole salamanders. And you can actually see, if we zoom in, I'll see if I can keep it separate in here. I'll put it in a petri dish for us. And this animal actually still has his gills. If you take a look right here, this is a good example of some of the other species of salamander larva that was also an early spring breeder. I don't know from just looking at them what species, but this is one of the probably the mole salamanders. So a spotted salamander, a smallmouth salamander, I'm not quite sure which species it's going to metamorphosize into, but you can see the gills are still present. So this one's got a little while to go before it finishes metamorphosizing. But if you look and all the vegetation we saw, this is what's living in there. A big mixture of many different species, and everything from toad tadpoles are in here. Some of the little black dots are in here. So right here, I'm going to find a couple of them. There's these tiny little black dot tadpoles over here. These are toad tadpoles. This one is really neat. This guy's trying to eat some of these. So this is that dragonfly nymph. And so I'll put him out here in the hand so you can see him. This guy is really good at eating tree frog tadpoles. So this is a good example of some of the food that some larger tadpoles and frogs eat, but it's also the prey of some of these smaller tadpoles, especially during some of the larval stages. And here's a little adult mosquito just landed here. So everybody's eating everybody else. Here's a pretty good example of a mayfly nymph, I believe, or some of the different species that are in here that either prey or predator, depending on the size of the tadpole or the salamander. Put these guys back. We'll say we're over here. So when you look at all these tadpoles, one of the things that we don't always think about is not all of them are going to metamorphosize at the same rate. So some of these species, though they might have been laid in late February, some of them are going to be really fast and they're going to be out by late April. They're all the way to a froglet or toadlet, depending on what species they are. But some of them take a long time. So one of the reasons why you find certain species in some ponds and not in other ponds is they've adapted for different purposes. So this one has lots of cover. It has lots of places to hide, lots of food. Protection from predation. Now, if you happen to be in a large pond with less vegetation, like a bullfrog or a green frog, their tadpoles actually get much larger, and they take a long time, at least 2 years to metamorphosize. And so they don't typically choose to live here. These guys choose and have adapted to living in these places, and so one of the ways they do that is by getting out, metamorphosizing faster. And some of it's food choice. So you come out really early, you only have certain sizes to eat, which is why a lot of your really early spring frogs are a lot smaller because the food is just not large at that point. Some of your later spring breeding frogs, food's a little larger, and they're typically a little larger. You get into the summertime, you get your big guys, and that's because there's a lot more food available. And so they've, over evolutionary time, spaced themselves out. But all of their breeding strategies and life stages are all very unique. I've talked for the most part about general life stages and mating systems, but if you spend time reading about all of them have some really unique things that are different from each one, but they're all pretty unique and pretty interesting. So we've looked at a couple different mating systems between frogs and toads and some salamanders, and we're going to go ahead and put the guys back that we've caught here. But it's important to remember that all of these guys need to stay wet. You notice I was wearing gloves, and it's, for the most part, is just so I don't keep the oil on their hands. Oil from my hands onto their body. but it's also for disease and stuff like that. I do a lot of different work in other locations, and there is a disease called chytrid or chytrid fungus, and it's spread worldwide, and we know it's here in Missouri and many other places in the world. And it's just good practice that if I'm going to go work other places, which is why I'm wearing gloves, I'm not going to accidentally transfer it. Now, chytrid dies typically when it's dry, so if you ever go out and you're hiking, it's just good practice to make sure you dry your shoes out in the sun or something like that before you go to another location. Or I also use about 10% bleach if I'm going between places and I can't let them sit and bake in the sun. That's the same thing for my nets and stuff like that. So it's just good practice if you ever get a chance to go out and look for frogs and toads, you happen to catch one or something like that. The other good one is all of these guys have toxins and different alkaloids in their skin. It's never going to hurt your hands. Just a great idea to wash them before you ever put them in your eyes or your hands, and some of those things can sometimes irritate your eye membranes and mouth and stuff like that. So it's just a good practice to remember to wash your hands if you're picking some of these guys up. And it's important to remember that if you do go to a place, just make sure that you have legal right to go pick some of those things up. Some places it is not allowed, and you need permission or a permit to do so. So thank you for joining our virtual field trip, and I hope you have a chance to go out to one of the places that you might be near and actually go out and do some of your own observations.